Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome everyone. And especially warm welcome to each of our panelists, whom I will very briefly just introduce without really going into details about their biographical background. The management of the conference has asked me not to go into those details. Each of our panelists has a very interesting and impressive biographical background. You can look that up in the apps that have been provided by the conference management. Myself, I'm Erwin Häckel from Germany, from the German Council on Foreign Relations, and I have the pleasure to steer this session through 1 hour and a half, and I expect and I hope that we have a lively discussion about our presentations. We have 3 speakers, 3 panelists from quite different backgrounds. One from France, one from South Korea, one from United Arab Emirates. You will realize that these are 3 very interesting countries of origin. France, of course, being the country with the most impressive program of nuclear power generation. In Europe, South Korea being, well, I might say, until now, again, the most impressive country in Asia with regard to the use of nuclear power, and the United Arab Emirates, not yet among those countries that enjoy the use of nuclear power, but presently, as I understand it, the country in the region that is poised to be the first Arab country to acquire the capability for the peaceful use of nuclear energy. Our 3 speakers to my left is Madame Pehuet, who graduated in international law and international economics, has been on government service and for a long period of time in the nuclear industry in France, and is now active as an independent energy consultant and writer on most recently financing of nuclear power. Professor Geun from South Korea has been educated as a political scientist and still going on to teach politics at the Korean National Diplomatic Academy. He has again had important advisory positions in the government of his country, and has made himself especially knowledgeable in connection with nuclear energy and nuclear proliferation. And lastly, Ambassador Alkaabi from the UAE is a nuclear engineer by training and is presently the representative of his country, the United Arab Emirates, with the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna. Before giving the floor to our panelists, each of them will be invited to speak, to give an introductory presentation of not more than 10 minutes. Thereafter, we are going to have a plenary discussion. Before taking that step, I would like to give a very brief consideration to our topic, the future of nuclear energy. You will realize that this is not a particularly new, novel, innovative topic. In fact, the question, what is the future of nuclear power, is an old one, a very old one, and I would say older than almost everyone in this room. The question, what is the future of nuclear power, has been asked at least since 1945, 70 years ago. And it has been asked time and again. It's interesting to speculate what is the reason. One of the reasons I would suggest is that nuclear power and nuclear energy, the use of nuclear technology, is a political affair, a highly politicized activity, and it has been from the beginning. It has been a widely and intensely discussed political question long before nuclear power came into reality. Nuclear power came into reality well, actually by the 1960s. And I think as we try to look into the future, and looking into the future and trying to shape the future is nothing else but politics. As we try to look into the future, it's necessary and useful to have a brief glance at the past. The past development of nuclear power over the last half century has been uneven but slow. It has been slower than had been anticipated in the early years of the so-called atomic age. Later, mostly in the 1970s, 1980s, the use of nuclear technology has picked up, and it reached a point of culmination in the 90s, in the mid-90s of the 20th century. Remarkably, since then, for the last 20 years, there has been a slow decline in the share of nuclear power in the total energy picture worldwide. At the same time, of course, obviously, the development has been very unequal. Some countries surging forth, such as France, and we have now 29 countries in the world using nuclear energy. That is less than was expected some decades ago, but still a sizable number. But at the same time, we have to realize that in most of these countries, the contribution of nuclear power to total energy consumption is minimal, almost negligible, tiny. And there's only a handful of countries where the use of nuclear electricity really contributes to sizable shares of total energy consumption. These countries are mostly in Europe. Presently, all of them are now in Europe, except with the exception of South Korea in East Asia. That's a remarkable fact in itself. Those countries that have more than 10% of their energy consumption coming from nuclear are just a handful. Small countries, except the two I mentioned, France and South Korea. That's the present state. Again, to sum it up, the development, globally speaking, of nuclear power has been slow, but very uneven. What this means for the future, we are now going to discuss. And with that, I'll keep my mouth shut and give the floor to Madame Pehuet. Fabienne, it's yours.
Good afternoon. As Erwin said, the development of nuclear power has been very much disrupted with stop and goes. And we're here to discuss, what it can be in the future years. I will make two opening comments before going directly to the topic. One concerns the relationship between nuclear power development and non-proliferation items. In my opinion, the future of nuclear power is very much linked to the confidence of the public in the peaceful development of nuclear energy. As we all say, some nuclear technologies are considered as potentially proliferant, like enrichment of uranium, for instance, and the agreement with Iran in this regard, in my opinion, is very important and a very good sign for the future development of nuclear power. I remember other instances. For instance, in the Carter years, separation of plutonium was considered potentially proliferant, and it was only with the recycling of the plutonium from the weapons that the MOX plants could be established in the USA and in Russia at the same time. Again, when we first thought about establishing spent fuel treatment plants one plant in China in the early years of 2000, it was long, lengthy conversations about proliferation issues. So it's very important. Other opening comment is what kind of horizon do we look at? I see two periods. Let's say we basically will not see spectacular technological breakthrough in nuclear power before, we know that until 2040 we will build basically the reactors we know now. And after that, we know we will probably have the fast breeders, third generation 4 reactors, and the fusion technology that will come afterwards ITER. What could change the relative competitiveness of the generation technologies is if the electricity storage would become readily available all of a sudden. So now, future of the nuclear power. I think there is a possibility of a bright future for nuclear power now. It does require very important enablers. And what I can see is that it will not be, it will be uneven geographically as far as development, and with a lot of reshuffling of cards among the actors. I see a bright future for the nuclear power development because we are observing a rapid growth of energy demand and electricity demand. As you know, a sizable share of the worldwide population doesn't have access to energy. And inside of energy, the growth of electricity should rise relatively a lot in comparison with others, because with the decarbonization of energy growth that we see in our economies, we are seeing that electricity usages increase more relatively to fossil usages. And considerable investment is required to meet this increasing demand for energy. The IAEA says that about $48,000 billion would be required. And inside of that, the share of electricity generation projects would be about $16,000 billion before 2025. Now, in a world where fighting against climate change is a widely accepted objective, it's pretty sure that a sizable share of those investments would concern renewables and nuclear power generation. Now, the exact share of the nuclear power generation depends on many conditions, and we'll address them. But what is sure is that marginal adjustments will not be enough. And plus, the changes has to occur rapidly. So that I'm absolutely convinced that renewables cannot cannot grow fast enough to satisfy the needs, and nuclear power is needed. Again, if electricity storage would become readily available, can change a little bit the picture. Now, there are some enablers that are necessary for nuclear power to develop rapidly. And it's mainly because nuclear power projects, as you know, are very capital intensive. 80% of the lifetime cost of a nuclear power plant is committed on the day of commissioning the plant. So that nuclear energy development needs, for sure, stable government energy policies, incentives to invest in new nuclear power plant projects, especially visibility over future revenues, electricity prices, to be clear. Probably an incentive also would be high CO2 prices or CO2 taxes, whatever, but to oriented investment towards this kind of technologies. Improved project management with a better control of construction risk. That's the highest risk for these projects. And control of risks, of construction risk, is also lowering cost. And obviously, no major nuclear accident in the near future. Now, this development, I think, is will happen, but it will be uneven geographically, with a major reshuffling of cards going on right now. What we see is that there is a fundamental shift of activity from the USA, Europe, Japan, and Korea to China, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East, basically from OECD countries to non-OECD countries. And this is the case as far as where the programs are taking place. I remind you that China will probably be the second nuclear power generation country before 2025, after the United States and before France. And this shift means that it's not just where the programs are being built. It also provoked major changes on the international scene. And the traditional competition has been disrupted. Until the mid of the 90s, vendors, technologies, and countries of origins were aligned, and the traditional export markets were identified for each large vendor. Now, this is not the case anymore. And I must say that in 2009, when Korea won the program in the UAE, that was a shock to a lot of vendors, let me tell you. And that really marked a real change. Now we have a supply chain, which is for the nuclear projects, that is becoming global, I would say, with localization of nuclear industries or the supply chain of the nuclear industries in the countries that are developing major programs. But at the same time, the headquarters of the major companies do remain in the OECD countries where they originate from. Financing also is now a major competitive advantage for basically non-OECD vendors in winning deals. That's a fairly different situation. When I say financing, it's financing packages, project governance, shares in equity, all these things. So now we have a new paradigm of competition for nuclear power plant projects that's really characterized by the overlapping of strong national systems still and pragmatic alliances and partnerships in realizing the projects. So it's a moving world. What will remain very important for nuclear development is focus, vision, and responsibility. Because when you undertake those kind of projects, well, it's a matter of 80 years, 100 years, something like that. So, basically what I have to say. I leave the floor to...
Thank you, Fabienne. And without further ado, we are going to our next speaker, Professor Geun, please.
Thank you. This, as the chair mentioned, this the topic of future of nuclear power is very old, and there are many articles and arguments, claims about that. And when I was asked to speak on this issue, just in 10 minutes, I was wondering how can I contribute to the dialogue on these issues. In fact, there are many, reports by authoritative organizations about the future of nuclear energy. IAEA, International Energy Agency, Nuclear Energy Agency, all they are publishing reports. So I thought that my role here could be confined to the telling the story about the politics of nuclear power, more specifically the trends in happening in this future of nuclear power. I think that's what I'm going to say. It's already mentioned, on the chair and the panelists here. So, what will be the future of nuclear power? Soon after the Fukushima accident, there was a sharp decline in both use and the public acceptance of nuclear power in many states. The nuclear share of global nuclear electricity production dropped to 11%, the lowest in decades. Even France and Korea, highly dependent on nuclear power energy, also announced to reduce their reliance on nuclear energy. On the other hand, according to an IAEA statistics, there are 65 new nuclear power plants under construction. Some statistics show it's 70, but the IAEA was saying it's 65. And these numbers are the most in recent decades. If we count planned and proposed nuclear plants, the number reaches up to almost 500, more than 440 under operation. These high numbers, though imaginary yet, show that many governments favor nuclear power to meet their increasing energy demands and CO2 gas reduction requirements. Here, we see two divergent futures of nuclear power. In order to foretell the future and prepare for it, we need to look at the politics of nuclear powers and its trends. I will present here three such trends. And these trends pose new opportunities and challenges. And I will also briefly present on how should we address them. First, let me begin with the three noticeable trends surrounding politics of nuclear power. First, at the global level, there are tandem trends of globalization and the polarization of nuclear technology and nuclear energy use. Before Fukushima accidents, there was a so-called global nuclear renaissance phenomenon. Despite the accident, however, those interests survived in many parts of the world. Now, civilian nuclear technology is more easily accessible than ever, either through IAEA or multiple nuclear suppliers. A more noticeable feature here is that two separate groups of states respond quite differently. One group of states move away further from the nuclear power. Another group of states, mostly energy resource poor and nuclear newcomers, stick to their plan to pursue nuclear programs. Secondly, at the national level, there is an increasing trend of energy security nationalism, or I call it nuclear energy security nationalism, and nuclear mercantilism. In the current world of energy insecurity and economic and political competition, states pursue nuclear power to strengthen their energy security and economic and technological competitiveness. For newcomers, nuclear power and technology become even symbols of economic and technological accomplishments and national pride. Third, at the society level, there is a renewed interest in nuclear energy in the developed and the Western states to fight climate change. I would call this trend nuclear environmentalism, or in the case of Bill Gates, we may call it nuclear humanism. Nowadays, we can see quite often those nuclear environmentalists appearing at the public debates, such as TED or CNN documentary, Pandora's Promise. That was somewhat different from this environment of dialogue in the decades ago. As mentioned above, these nuclear trends poses unique opportunities and challenges to our decision to use nuclear power. I will address them briefly. First, globalization and the polarization of nuclear use and technology poses great nuclear proliferation, nuclear security, and safety risks. Nuclear proliferation, nuclear terrorism anywhere would greatly undermine support and trust for nuclear energy everywhere. Therefore, to reduce those dangers, we need to work with a lot of existing nuclear safety security mechanisms. Many of them are still unfulfilled promises. such as additional protocol of IAEA and Convention for the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material for the nuclear security, and a complete nuclear test ban treaty or fissile material cut-off treaty. All those are still ongoing projects. We need to universalize those commitments. Polarization of nuclear power may result in a new kind of a nuclear divide between nuclear power plants have and nuclear power plants have not. In addition, mass production, mass construction, and operation of nuclear plants in a short period is raising serious human resource and safety problems. There should be international and regional effort to address this disparity and the nuclear safety problems, either led by IAEA or other nuclear technology leading states. Second, we can't blame nuclear energy or energy security nationalism when states pursue those policies. However, considering dual-use nature of nuclear technology, concerns for nuclear proliferation, security, and safety should be fully addressed. Especially, we need to pay attention to the demands of national programs of enrichment and reprocessing by some states as their nuclear energy program expands. Since traditional reprocessing is not an answer anymore, we need to work together by putting together research-funded technology to find more appropriate solutions. Also, by establishing multilateral or regional programs, we could reduce nuclear proliferation and the security risks. Lastly, new interest in nuclear energy from various parts of society, especially in the developed society, as represented by nuclear environmentalism or nuclear humanism, may help us to find a breakthrough in developing new kinds of reactors with greater safety and non-proliferation features. In this regard, recently, small modular reactors, fast reactors, and pyroprocessing received attentions. In summary, a recent report by International Energy Agency and the OECD assessed that in order to manage climate change risks, we need to increase the share of nuclear energy in total energy generation up to 17% by 2050. That means we need to double nuclear power generation capacity. As I mentioned, the new trends of nuclear globalization, polarization, nationalism, environmentalism poses new challenges, opportunities for the safer, economical, environmental use of nuclear energy. In order to address these adverse effects, we need to work together, strengthen international and national nuclear non-proliferation security safety regimes. We also need to pursue international and regional cooperation programs not only for technological and the financial synergy effects, but also for greater nuclear transparency and trust. As we combine positive effects of global enthusiasm for nuclear power together with nuclear environmentalism, humanism, we could build a new consensus for nuclear power as an effective and reliable and low-carbon energy source until we discover a better energy source. Thank you.
Thank you, Bong, for this contribution. And now, thirdly, Ambassador Alkaabi, please.
Well, thank you very much. Okay. Well, for me, I'm not in the business of speculation what's the future of nuclear power, but to understand the future of nuclear power, really we have to look at the numbers we have today in today's world, which has been presented at various formats by the previous speakers in terms of number of reactors, over 400 operating today. In terms of electricity share from nuclear, in 2014, it actually exceeded 11% of the world electricity. As we also heard, 60-plus reactors are under construction today, and more reactors are being planned by other countries, mostly expansion in big programs in East Asia, but also in new countries like my country, the United Arab Emirates, was building new 4 reactors that are in advanced stage of construction today. Also, significant capacity is being upgraded in some Western countries through programs of uprating, but also extension of life of some of the reactors. So the picture that we have today, even though there was some decline in terms of expansion, in terms of the uneven distributions and so on, there is actually a good positive picture of nuclear power today in terms of numbers, in terms of reliance on nuclear power, but also to a certain level public confidence and acceptance. That varies, I understand, from country to country. Some are more positive than others, but generally nuclear power continue to be seen as a major contributor to an energy portfolio today in many countries. This is obviously driven by the need for energy that other sources not necessarily can provide immediately at the same commercial competitiveness and the environmental competitiveness as well. Nuclear power also seen now as a major contributor to efforts in relation to mitigation of climate change. Today, nuclear power considered as a clean energy source that actually competes with all the other sources because of the rate that you can deploy nuclear power. In fact, some recent studies suggested that it is the largest and maybe the only source of low-carbon electricity that will be a base load in the near future. I think the other technologies can be aggressively developed, but still, as of today, nuclear power will continue to play a major role in that mix. And this is really important as we come to Paris Convention coming up in a couple of weeks or so, in the role that nuclear power can play in supporting the goals of decarbonization of energy portfolios. Of course, this interest in nuclear power, or the positive image or the positive status today, we have to look at how to ensure the right environment for healthy expansion and healthy use of nuclear power. And this comes to really basic principles on the way nuclear power can be developed and maintained. Transparency obviously becomes very essential, and we heard public confidence. How do you achieve public confidence in light of all the risk associated with nuclear power? There is some safety concern, there is non-proliferation concern, there are security concerns, and these issues are linked to the nature of nuclear technology. You cannot just say today I'm not going to worry about them. They are part of any decision to pursue nuclear power. But there is also a way to address these challenges through the right policies, through the right infrastructure, and through the right approaches that the governments and countries can pursue, but also through a transparent way in developing nuclear power program. In the UAE, we obviously aspire to set an example on how nuclear power programs can be developed through a transparent process, but also the international cooperation, the engagement of the program. It really demonstrates that to have a viable commercial program today, you have to have this policy and surrounding infrastructure. If you want an expensive program that's isolated, you can still do that, but that's not what we're talking about when it comes to future of nuclear power. The future of nuclear power should be driven by the need for electricity. And the need for electricity means you have to have a program that is commercially viable. Commercially viable means you have to focus on producing energy, forget about the sensitive technologies, focus on very simple argument of I need electricity from this reactor. I've been engaged in certain workshop and seminar associated with financing nuclear power expansion in the future. And one of the main outcome of these workshops and meetings are basically one element which states having the right infrastructure, appropriate and adequate infrastructure in place, in particular having clear policies and a strong independent regulator, has direct impact on how much you can finance these projects in the future. And this also will contribute to public confidence. This will also contribute to international acceptance for such a program. I think it's something that we have today, but then you need to work on it. You continue to develop and ensure always the public engagement is part of any program. Building the public confidence is by being transparent in what you do and what you don't do, but also what efforts needs to be done. But also I think there is some education part that we need to do when it comes to nuclear power. We also, what happened after Fukushima, when the media took a really strong stance against nuclear power, based on pictures, based on videos that came from Japan. But when you actually look at the technical aspects of it in terms of what went wrong and what injuries or what victims came was as a result of this accident, the numbers does not add up to the campaign that went into or against nuclear power at the time. So this is the reason why I believe we have to do more education and more outreach engagement. The other point, or the last point I'd like to touch upon here, is the non-proliferation aspect. Obviously, having a successful program, a healthy program, requires both the support of the international community and the public in that country. Non-proliferation concerns, no questions, are serious concerns. It can easily put a program on hold. It can easily move a program from being commercially viable to a program that only meant to support some national agenda and so on. It actually takes the life of a program from being a healthy program to an isolated program that's not there. So that's why non-proliferation concerns are serious issues that need to be addressed in any future program. I've heard comments that Iran agreement could be seen as a positive example. I don't think that's a good example. I think the way forward for the expansion of nuclear power, when we look at the numbers and when you look at the cost associated with development nuclear power program, adding the cost of development of enrichment capacities or extensive sensitive technology associated with that, that actually move your program from being attractive, commercially viable program to a program that's expensive, that's not viable from commercial point of view. It will not attract international vendors. It will not have a positive impact on the overall perception of that program, which is directly linked to ability to finance the program, ability to attract partners, and so on. With that, I'll stop here, but it's really, I think, the reality tell us the future of nuclear power is good, it's positive, it has to be responsible. This is the message I'd like to end up with.
Thank you, Hamad. Now, it seems to me that there's a broad agreement among our panelists that there is some reason for optimism regarding the future of nuclear power worldwide, with some qualifications and reservations, some ifs. If that happens, such as non-proliferation, economics, finance, safety, security, environmental acceptance, public support. Now, it seems to me that these are not new qualifications. They have been with us all the time. And the reason, and the question then is, what is different in the future that would influence or reverse the trend of nuclear power worldwide stagnating or being reduced? One aspect which is certainly the one that has been stressed several times among our panelists, and which is certainly a new development, is the shift from OECD countries to non-OECD countries. That's a very interesting and intriguing factor, especially if we consider the fact that the nuclear industry being a heavily regulated industry, the rules of regulation for decades have been made mostly by the West, by OECD countries. If these countries are receding on the stage of nuclear energy, and especially Asia is coming forth as the major growth factor, the question is, of course, what does that mean for the future political international setup of nuclear energy? I would like just to throw that into our discussion, but now, before going further into that, I would invite the audience to raise their points. I should like to ask anyone making an intervention or asking a question to tell us your name and your affiliation, and if possible, put questions rather than statements to the panel. If you address the panel, it would be preferable if you name the person where you would prefer to receive an answer. And lastly, please speak clearly and distinctly, because not everyone in this room speaks English as his or her mother tongue. In fact, we are a multicultural audience here, comparable perhaps to the Catholic Church, and so we have to be careful to understand each other. Yes, please, sir, you are the first.
Christopher Watson, here on behalf of British Pugwash, but a lifetime member of the nuclear community. I would like to make some general comments on what all three panelists have told us, which come from my particular background. First is that different countries have had very different experiences. Great Britain has had experience of having had 20% of nuclear power for decades. We then had a brief drop, but we're now in the process of getting back to 20%, and we're doing so entirely by purchasing third-generation reactors from abroad. Second point is that although you've all mentioned global warming, none of you have given relevant facts and figures related to that, and I think those are vital. And they're very well presented in a recent publication by the British Department of Energy and Climate Change, which has made available a nice piece of software which anybody can download and run, and they can design their own global future going up to the year 2100. And you merely have to set 45 parameters, and the software will then tell you what the outcome is, and in particular, what the average temperature rise on the surface of the Earth is. They also give you 25 example pathways produced by different organizations with different vested interests. At one extreme is the Friends of the Earth contribution, which has zero nuclear, unsurprisingly. At the opposite the end of the scale is the World Nuclear Association, which comes up with two pathways, the faster of which has, if I remember rightly, about 30% of nuclear energy by the year 2100. So there is an enormously wide range of possible outcomes. British Pugwash's contribution to all this has been to look at the credibility of the technologies of each of three different pathways, a high nuclear one, a high renewables one, and an intermediate one, including carbon capture and storage. We've concluded that all three pathways are perfectly possible. All three will achieve something like the targets for control of climate change, but all three have potential showstoppers. And none of you have really, to my mind, addressed this question of showstoppers. So far as nuclear is concerned, the problem is that the third generation technology, which is the only one that anybody would now want to buy, is not really proven. And there are a number of examples of stations which have not achieved their design parameters yet. That's not to say they won't do, but I'd be interested to hear what the panel has to say about its assessment of the credibility of the rather small number of third-generation reactors now on the market. As regards high renewables, the problem is intermittency, and nobody has got a really workable solution for a very high proportion of renewables which solves the intermittency problem. There's lots of hopes about energy-saving schemes, but none of them have been economically quantified. The intermediate one, involving carbon capture and storage, all the elements of that technology have been proven, but nobody has ever put it together and shown that it's economic on the required scale. So I put it to you that the future is wide open, but nuclear has as good a chance as either of the others, if not, as the panel has indicated, somewhat better.
Thank you. I think that has been a question or a statement that's addressed to the whole panel. I believe the next question comes from James Acton.
Thank you. James Acton from the Carnegie Endowment. For all of the challenges of non-proliferation and economics, in many parts of the world, the single most urgent challenge hasn't been discussed, and that's spent fuel management. That you have a reality that in Taiwan there could be reactors that will shut down because of a lack of space in the storage pools. Japan and South Korea, that's not so immediate, but it's not unimaginable either. So my question to any of the panel that wants to address it is, how can the nuclear industry best face the challenge of managing spent fuel? Not in terms of geological disposal, but in terms of interim storage. And if your answer is new technology of some description, please try and convince me that that new technology can be developed in a time frame that is useful for dealing with the problem.
Sir, yes.
I'm Bob Einhorn from the Brookings Institution in Washington. The panelists have talked about prospects for the growth of nuclear power. I wonder if they could address prospects for the spread of sensitive fuel cycle technologies, enrichment and reprocessing, especially focused on the Middle East and Northeast Asia. The Emirati ambassador touched on this subject, but maybe could elaborate a bit further on it.
One more intervention here, the lady.
Hello, my name is Catherine Bachner from Brookhaven National Lab. Thanks to all of the panelists. I really enjoyed your talks. You all cited the importance of public acceptance moving forward with nuclear energy, and you also made the connection with nuclear transparency. So I wonder if any of you would be willing to talk about how specifically those types of successful public acceptance campaigns have been undertaken.
Thank you. I think that you will be the next. But let us first give an opportunity to the panelists to respond. Two of the questions have raised an important point that, in fact, had not been mentioned on the panel. That is the problems of the front end and back end of the fuel cycle. We have assumed more or less just as a given that what we are talking about are light water reactors of the present design, perhaps slightly modernized, but the questions of fuel supply enrichment and spent fuel reprocessing have not been touched upon. It would be useful to take them into account. Whoever would like to respond first, Fabienne.
I can start maybe with one of the last questions about spreading of enrichment technologies and reprocessing technologies. My co-panelist did point a very important fact, which is these kind of industries are they're challenging in terms of making revenues from them. You know, there is a market, there is an enrichment services market worldwide. So it means that if you have an enrichment plant, you want to make money with sending your enrichment services. It doesn't make sense to establish any of those plants if you don't have the market for it, except if you want to develop a military program, but that's another story. It's even more true for reprocessing. You can be profitable with a reprocessing plant only if you have if you reprocess the spent fuel of about 50 reactors. Under that, it's very extremely challenging. So I would say you will not establish a reprocessing plant everywhere for 800 tons or whatever. I mean, it's just would not make economic sense at all. And maybe I will then go to spent fuel, to the questions on spent fuel management. Well, there are technologies to take care, to manage spent fuel and waste, which is one is treatment, the other one is temporary, is interim storage, and then long-term storage. I mean, those technologies exist. I don't really see what your question is.
Why don't we have them in Taiwan, Japan, South Korea? And what's the issue there?
Taiwan and South Korea could very well be, customers of the French reprocessing plant in La Hague. I mean, I know that for sure when I was at Areva, we went to Taiwan several times trying to get them as customers, you know. It's just a matter of, you make an offer, the countries, the customers say yes, no, maybe, whatever. But establishing reprocessing plants in one given country, let's say in Taiwan, would not make any sense. I mean, just economically. But having access to the service in a regional plant or, now it's France, but whatever, it makes a lot of sense. Then I'll have a comment to make about public acceptance if we have time. Otherwise, I'll talk to you later.
I think all of us, the question raised very difficult questions, and I don't think any of us have a full answer.
Press your button, please.
Oh, sorry.
That's right.
Yeah, they may have opinions, but I don't think they have full answers or correct answers. Each one of them have. At the moment, concerning this future nuclear industry, I mentioned about trends, but there are very thorny, practical, imminent issues at the moment we have to tackle. There are several. I think those questions raised them. Spent fuel management, a very serious one, and the decommissioning and the replacing those aging nuclear power plants. We are hearing about the 200 or something is about 30, 40 years old, so we have to do something about it. And also ensuring safety of mass-constructed nuclear power plants at the moment. And all these issues, and also spread of and the demands of enrichment and reprocessing. And specifically returning to the spread of possibility of spread of sensitive technology, I believe there is as I mentioned, there is a strong demand from all parts of the world that because of practical reasons, sometimes of political reasons, and some economic regions, they would like to have one. But there should be some, instead of saying no, there should be some multilateral or regional approach so that in the region they care of that those issues more of an open, transparent way. There could be one of the solutions. And we could say no to the moment until some country just break away. And Iran is an example of breakaway. And I'm hearing that still Korea would like to, because we are seeing that there is experts are saying there is a economic senses of having enrichment and reprocessing facilities in Korea, but we don't because of various political reasons. Because there is economic reasons, I think there should be some political solutions to deal with such demands, and also what else? And the spent fuel management. In Korea, we have a real difficulty of either having interim storage or geological or whatever reprocessing. And reprocessing, I said that this is not an answer at the moment. It used to be an answer. And at the moment, Japan has tons of plutonium that's becoming a serious nuclear security and non-proliferation problems. So we have to have another technological breakthrough to deal with these spent fuel problems. I think in the meantime, interim storage should be really an interim answer to these problems. I think Korea will be pursuing interim storage, and at least we can set that problem aside a couple decades. But I think there should be strong demands to look for eternal solutions, either through permanent geological repository, or either fast reactor something for the future. Fast breeder.
Well, there was a question about the third generation nuclear power reactors technology, whether it's proven or not. These reactor technology, the advanced third reactor technology, are actually based on previous reactor design as fundamental core design. So a lot of these systems that are incorporated in the new reactor designs are actually proven technology from previous generation. So it's not necessarily complete unproven design. There are some elements of it that are considered improvement, but the design itself, the technology, it's not completely new, I would say, that require to be proven in a significant way as a new technology. The role of nuclear power scenarios, I think that's, I hear you. There is so many different views and interest on how this scenarios will look like. But I think, in my view, all of these technologies will be needed to meet the energy demand, but also to meet the environmental and climate change mitigation efforts. So nuclear power will be a major contributor, whether it was 30% or 15%, but I believe it will be there. It also comes the question in terms of policy decisions, at what cost do you want to completely decarbonize your economy, and at what scale, at what timeline? This will be determined what technology you want to use and how much you want to spend on developing that technology. There's some technologies that are readily available today, such as nuclear, but then there are technologies that still need to be development, such as storage technologies and other that could support other technologies. And it really comes to the question of putting all these equations together to come up with a scenario that acceptable from both cost, environment, and so on. The spent fuel management question is a significant question that still continue to be one of the challenges in relation to nuclear power. There is technologies today that support the dry cask storage, enlargement of spent fuel storage, but also when it comes to spent fuel, the geological repository seems getting more track, especially here in Europe, where there's more advanced programs to develop that. Of course, there is other type of waste that needs to be also dealt with, the medium, low, and low-level waste. That's usually, there is solution that's industrially available today. The challenges has always been in terms of picking a site and working around the public acceptance of that site in relation to these issues. But I think from technical and industrial point of view, solutions are actually there. It's just a question of getting them to be implemented. And I think the dry cask storage approach is not necessarily a bad approach because it gives you actually long time to develop your final disposal approach. And this is not necessarily a bad, not necessarily considered a no scenario. It is actually a scenario that gets you to the next level. In terms of there was a public acceptance on what's the approach that's been used. I can tell you what the UAE is doing on that. Just a few days ago, actually, we finished another public forum. We call for public to join sometimes the regulator, sometimes the plant owner to come hear presentation on the progress of the program, meet with the people involved in the program, answer questions, and so on. These 4 public forums has been very successful and generated a lot of public acceptance, but also the public feels part of the program as a result of that. But also they've proven to be good for actually recruitment purposes as well. Other means that we use for transparency is we established public committees or advisory committees, such as the International Advisory Committee in the UAE, which basically it's a committee that meets twice a year, hear presentations and progress report and challenge the stakeholders on different topics in relation to the program, and then publish its reports. And all these reports are actually available publicly on the website where the public or the international community can read them. I think all these elements help building the public confidence and acceptance in the efforts that the government is doing in this area.
Thank you. I think we are at an important point here where the question has been put, are there technological constraints for a future expansion of nuclear power? And I think the point is well taken that there are actually no serious technological constraints. 400 plus reactors have been running and operating quite satisfactorily for several decades. So that could give reason for confidence. But still, this does not work as a build-up of confidence in those countries where nuclear power has a long tradition to be used. Look at the United States with the largest nuclear power program in the world. 35 years or so, no new reactor has been built or licensed. There has been transparency. There have been public hearings. There have been quite extensive efforts by the industry, or for that matter by the government, to increase confidence, and still it does not work. It might quite be a different case, say, in Asian countries, and that would be very interesting to learn about. But apparently there is no prospect in the Western world for nuclear power to really pick up speed in the next, the future, whatever the future is. Let's just talk about until the mid of the century or so. Yes, please, just come in.
I just want to comment a little bit about the USA and the evolution of what happened. At some point, the U.S. government did establish rules to favor nuclear power new build projects with many incentives to the new projects. And then what happened is the development of shale gas. So now you have a discrepancy. Well, there are two things. First, the liberalization of electricity markets in some states, which makes, as I mentioned before, very difficult to develop new nuclear projects. And second, the new, let's say the drop of price of gas in the United States. So it's kind of who would develop a nuclear power project in that context. Now, very recently, I think President Obama did stated that they will reestablish some incentives to nuclear power programs. And I'm not a specialist, but so this comes and goes.
Well, Mr. Obama has tried to give a shot in the arm to the nuclear industry for his now 7 years of incumbency. It did not work, which means even if there is a government that tries to give support, political support to the nuclear industry in a liberalized energy market, that is not enough to get it going. Unless you are trying to intervene, especially at this point, I would first go in our sequence, the lady here first, then down there, and then you are third.
Seher Kamran, I'm the member of Senate of Pakistan. First of all, I would like to compliment all the speakers for a brilliant talk in a very short span of time. And sir, I would like to second your comment that the nuclear energy and nuclear power is all about the politics. And we at our region, we are witnessing that politics while the civil nuclear deal has been granted to India and Pakistan has been denied the same, where the panelists agree that the reliance on the nuclear energy would be increased by 70% by 2025. So we see that exactly what's the politics involved in like depriving Pakistan of having the membership of the NSG and to benefit from the usage of nuclear energy while we have all the infrastructure, we have brilliant scientists, and we are in a dire need of technology to overcome our energy shortage at this time. And secondly, I would like to ask Mr. Alkaabi, as he had made a comment that Iran agreement with Iran was not a good one, if you can further elaborate on that. Thank you.
I want to address my questions and comments to all of the panelists. I will introduce myself. I'm Ray Levite. I'm from the Carnegie Endowment. And for the past 8 years, we've been leading a process with all the nuclear vendors worldwide to develop some principles on which they would guide their export of nuclear power plants. And we're about to walk out of that process after 8 years because we are deeply, deeply worried at the state of the industry. In a nutshell, the situation is that the economic realities are forcing all the players to cut corners in the most alarming sense conceivable. And as a result, I am deeply, deeply worried about where this industry would look like down the road. I will point out just three things very quickly. Number one, in the absence of the standardization of requirements and standardization of regulation. And sort of the industry has no future. There is no harmonization of regulatory requirements. In fact, we're moving further and further away from it as you pointed out, the Chairman, we're moving away from, say, a Western-dominated and so on. And in the implementation of this, in some of those cases, we're getting a heavily politicized definition of what the requirements ought to be. And if the resources are not available, as they are, as Ambassador Alkaabi, everyone is saying, UAE is a gold standard. We can't meet that gold standard. Sorry, guys. Yes, the technical solutions are there, but we can't afford to do it, and the government doesn't insist, so why should we care? The second is the division of labor between the various stakeholders responsible to get the nuclear program to be serious aren't there. between the vendors and the operators and the regulators and the political masters of the regulators and then so on, they're not there. And even the ones who are supposedly holding the tradition of doing things right, notwithstanding the fact that it was in Russia, China, and Japan, and the US in which the biggest accidents have occurred. Let's remind ourselves. 400 reactors are operating, but where the big accidents have occurred were in the 3 most developed ones, nuclear power operators. So I think even the Americans and the Russians are not the models to emulate. UAE may be, but not these guys. So I think we're dealing with a truly catastrophe in the making in many of these areas. Yes, the technical solutions are there. Dry casks, fine. And lastly, about the Iran thing. I listened very carefully to Helga Schmidt this afternoon. She said, we want to make sure the entirely peaceful nature of the program. But a program that doesn't meet the requirements, does enrichment make sense in Iran? When they have one nuclear power plant that gets all its energy from Russia, and where they don't meet the minimalist standards of safety, security, liability, and handling of spent fuel? Is that an entirely peaceful program? So the question I think this forum needs to address, and I would like to draw the panelists, is what can we do to actually harmonize the standards of what responsibility actually implies in the nuclear domain? Everyone agreed that responsibility is the key term. How do we actually implement responsibility? The IAEA hasn't been able to do it. Everyone is keeping the IAEA standards the lowest. When you now had the review of the Convention on Nuclear Safety, who were the ones who were holding the modification of the Convention? The Americans and the Russians in collusion.
Thank you. Since you just mentioned Helmut Schmidt, the former West German Chancellor who passed away yesterday, it's interesting to note that Mr. Schmidt, Helmut Schmidt. Sorry. Yeah. But still, I pick up the point, even if I misunderstood it. Helmut Schmidt was the German Chancellor who was supportive of nuclear power as nobody before and after him. His vision was to make Germany the leader in nuclear technology worldwide, and look how he failed in his ambition. So political support alone is just not enough. Forgive me for this diversion. The gentleman down there.
Tatsu Suzuki from Nagasaki University, Japan. I have one comment and 2 questions. Given the experience of Fukushima accident in Japan, I'm not that optimistic about the future of nuclear power, particularly the impact of the accident on public trust and also the huge liability questions, which leads to my question. The economic consequence of nuclear accident in Japan is so enormous. The decommissioning itself would take at least $10 billion. The current compensation amount already $50 billion. It's going to up to probably $100 billion. So my question to all of you is, how are you going to incorporate such costs once accident happens into the nuclear power economics? And the liability scheme should be the one key question to be managed. But I have a question for all of you. How are you going to manage this cost of accident? The second question is the back end of fuel cycle, the plutonium issue. Japan has already 48 tons, as you know, and we have a problem of reducing the stockpile. Particularly my questions to French panelists. You have also roughly 50, 60 tons of plutonium. And British also has 100 tons. And the British now is saying that they are willing to take the title of Japanese plutonium in UK. So my questions to France, are you willing to also do the same thing like UK does to take the Japanese plutonium stockpile to manage the plutonium in Japan? I mean the UK, in France. Thank you.
Last question on this round here, please.
Thank you. I'm Tom Countryman, Assistant Secretary of State in the United States for non-proliferation issues. Just one correction. There are 4 nuclear power plants under construction in the U.S. today. Just 5 days ago, the White House held a summit meeting on nuclear energy and climate change, announcing several new initiatives, but underlining the fact that if we are to meet the goals that we will set at the Paris conference in the next month, nuclear energy must be an essential part of a carbon-reduced energy future. My general comment is, while there's great potential for nuclear energy, and my government supports it as we say, an all-of-the-above approach to reducing carbon emissions, there has to be honest talk that the obstacles to expanded use are economic and political and non-proliferation and security. And it is not helpful to confuse one with the other, but to speak honestly about all the obstacles. To wit, there's no justification for any country, including Iran, to develop an enrichment program when there is such overcapacity in today's global market for enrichment of uranium. Reprocessing, whether it is traditional reprocessing or pyroprocessing, in either case, it has complex issues of non-proliferation, of nuclear security, of regional relations, and obstacles of economics that I think no country has, including the U.S., has solved. Perhaps France has come closer than anyone else to making reprocessing cycle and mixed oxide cycles economically viable, but nobody else has, and my personal belief is that no one else will. And then to identify some problems as political is difficult, but let me point at one that crosses the economic and political line. Obviously, another accident like Fukushima would have devastating consequences for the future of nuclear power. But there's another one I worry about, which is in contracting, in bidding for nuclear power plant construction, there is an alarming lack of transparency. And there are entities involved in both vending and purchasing who have less than transparent business practices. There will be scandals, I predict, about who got paid to sign a contract, what the side payments were, what were the hidden costs. And those will do as much to erode public trust in nuclear power as any accident. Thanks.
Thank you. It seems to me that among the last comments from several speakers, it emerged that the economics of nuclear power are not at all a resolved issue. They may be not a problem in countries like the UAE, and it's certainly an interesting case to watch further cases like the UAE. But of course, in UAE, several of the problems that are rampant in other countries, such as finance or public support or regulation, are simply not there or not really insurmountable, whereas in the so-called old nuclear countries, they are there. And there is not an obvious way to overcome them, which then again leads us back to what we realized at the beginning, that the shift of dynamics and growth in the nuclear industry is going to those countries which have either no experience or not the experience of European Western countries. What that means, we don't really know. We are going into uncharted territory, but it would be, of course, naive to think that the politics of regulation as have been developed in Western countries will smoothly be accepted by other countries, especially in Asia. Why should they just follow our example? I believe we have to look at our watch. So one last intervention, please. And be brief, please.
Two quick points arising from our recent discussion. The first is the economics of nuclear power. This is a very difficult subject to discuss because there is not a level playing field on any account. In the comparison between nuclear and renewables, renewables have been hugely subsidized to an extent which the nuclear industry can only be jealous of, so that one needs to remove all hidden subsidy when comparing prices. Secondly, most of the recent studies of the cost of nuclear have been on first-of-a-kind plants of one sort or another. And that's not a helpful number. What's required is a serial production cost. And I predict that it will turn out that when we get those, which is not yet, it will be much more favourable to nuclear than the present estimates. Second point is on plutonium. It's been rightly pointed out that Britain has the largest existing stockpile of over 100 tons of separated plutonium. France, a close competitor, Russia coming not far behind. There's quite a lot of separate, all at the moment stored very safely, well guarded, and has been not threatened for decades. The reason why we're doing it now is because we believe that by about 2050, there will be a need to have fourth-generation reactors, and we'll need a large supply of plutonium in order to get started. So it's not a stupid policy to build up a stockpile against that eventuality, which would certainly arise if nuclear power grows to the extent which the optimists think that it will.
Thank you for this comment. I'm afraid we will have to draw our meeting to a close, but before that, I would like to ask any of our panelists if they would like to add an answer, please.
Just to conclude, I heard a lot of comments in terms of the economy of nuclear power, and then link that to the more sensitive technologies in relation to enrichment and reprocessing. And I think we have to look at these two things separately. If we're talking about the economy of a nuclear power program, not necessarily associated with the economy of a nuclear program with the sensitive technologies. If the objective is to export and things, that's a whole different story. It's not necessarily related to the economy of producing power at that time. I think the comments we heard today in relation to the reliability of the international fuel market, it's strong. I think the incentives to pursue sensitive technology may not be the same level of interest in nuclear power or expansion of nuclear power. The question we heard today about what we need to do to ensure the regulation, the safety standards are carried away with different vendors, different countries, I think that's something we've been calling for quite some time. And the challenge is when partners decided this is not working for them anymore, and they decided this is not a helpful because of economy reason, because of the current status and so on. But the UAE, when we pursued our model, we put certain points to this model that we feel this is where nuclear power in the future can be done in a safe and secure manner with the full support of the international community. But again, not everybody signed up to that model, and that's a sad story.
I want to make just a very brief couple of comments. Iran's nuclear deal is a political deal. It's not an economic deal in any sense. You know, North Korea's U.S. DPRK deal of 1994, and all these deals are political. It cannot be, replicated in any other cases. It's just that way. It should be treated in that way, and of course that if there is more exceptions like that. We had in India's case, Iran's case, North Korea's case, that's going to hurt the health of a non-proliferation regime. they should not be, carefully handled. And the Pakistan case, of course, Pakistan wanted to have access to civilian nuclear technology, but as long as you have a nuclear weapons program, and it's going to be very difficult. Just like India's case, it caused a lot of problems. India's case, so there should be some dialogue on that issue. And public acceptance issue that I forgot to mention briefly, and the dialogue itself doesn't solve the problem, I believe. The needs, when people are consent to the needs of nuclear energy, I think they could accept it. And also, there should be a big problem of national needs of nuclear energy versus regional burden. In Korea, always the biggest problem. There should be some compensation mechanism for that. And I better just stop there.
I'll make a comment, first on the cost of nuclear. The recent study by the International Energy Agency on levelized cost of electricity still shows that nuclear power apparently can favorably compete with other generation technologies, so let's say good. There is still a challenge, though, on the cost of the new programs and the new Gen 3 programs. I think after Taishan, OL3, Flamanville come to the grid, it will be very reassuring for the market. And I agree with you, as far as now, we still don't have a standardization of Gen 3 reactor technology. About plutonium, stockpiles of plutonium, I would agree with you. There are two things that you can do with your plutonium. Is either you recycle it by fabricating MOX fuel and you load the MOX fuel in your existing reactors. And I know that in Japan you have a program for MOX fuel, or you wait and you can use it in your fourth generation reactors, I would say. That's all I can say about that. I had another comment, a general comment about the worries about what's going on in the market. Let's say there are a lot of uncertainties, and just I would not have a catastrophe view like you have, but I would say, a reactor is built on the territory. So you need to have very strong authorities on that territory, because if there is an accident or whatever, it is the population there which is first to be harmed. And so you need a very strong safety authority. It's in France, the safety authority is so strong and so independent that they can decide at any time and with no, they just can decide to stop your operation. They just, that's it. It's very important. So they need to be competent and independent. Also, when bidding for new programs, I am very much, puzzled by how the bids are won sometimes. It becomes, rules of the game are more and more complicated, let's say. And finally, a little story about public acceptance. We had an interesting case in France about the geological storage. A law had to be passed in 2006 about what kind of storage, what kind of geological storage. At the time, it was said that the best solution was to store the waste in, deep in earth forever, let's say. Now, there was, we asked a sociologist to do a study about what does it mean for the French people. What does that mean? The results were kind of interesting. If you talk to the people about, 100 years from now, okay, it's your grandchildren, so it's acceptable. If you talk about 1,000 years, my God, it's history, what is going, and all this waste in deep Mother Earth, it's going to, in the French culture. If you talk about 200,000 years or over that, it's eternity. It's not, you can be. So we discovered that the French people were very much confident in their scientists, even in their politicians, but that was not acceptable for the public. So this is the reason why, one of the reasons why the decision was taken to build a reversible geological storage, which economically doesn't make any sense, but it's, that's how public acceptance was taken into account in that instance.
Thank you. I'm sorry we have already overrun our time, and it's quite apparent that we opened up more questions than we could answer, and on several questions we did not reach an agreement. And as a chairman, I feel that's a very satisfactory result, because discussion that everyone leaves with the impression that everything is cleared up was not really a good discussion. And as I said before, the question of the future of nuclear power is an old one. I am certain that maybe if your children sometime will meet again in this room, they will again discuss the question of the future of nuclear power. I take the opportunity and thank our panel very warmly for their contribution. And I thank the audience for their thought-provoking questions. Thank you.